Morning, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for a conversation about meeting the regulator and what you should and shouldn't do from an ex-regulator and body language experts. So joined here by Shannon and Danny Lawlor. It'd be great. I think we'll start with you, Danny, if you could please just give a super quick overview and intro as to what you do.
Sure. Hi, Eric, and great to be here this morning. I am a financial services lawyer by training and spent a number of years working with the financial regulator in Ireland, which is the Central Bank of Ireland. I left a few years ago. One of the jobs that I do now is work with firms as they prepare for engagement with the central bank and help them to get the best outcomes that they can.
Cool, thank you. And Shannon?
Well, I'll speak in the area of what I do at Aquest. So Danny and I, a couple of years ago, recognized that there was a lot of synergies between what I do in the area of human behavior and what he does in preparing regulated firms to meet the regulator. Mm-hmm. So I'm a human behavior specialist. I read body language. It is not something that I just do. Normally, it requires a lot of active listening and study. So I am able to provide insight into whether you're bluffing, whether you're lying, whether you're completely prepared, and maybe some tells as to what you can do when you're under a lot of stress and pressure to improve that experience.
Cool, no, great, thank you. And Danny, where would you start with meeting the regulator? I mean, you've written a great piece about that, but for everyone that hasn't read that, where would you start? What sort of overwhelming advice would you give?
Well, I'd start at the end. I'd start with what you are looking to achieve when you exit that meeting and you close the door and you're walking away reflecting on what's happened. So I would start with what those things are that you want to have achieved in the meeting. And for me, when I'm working with an individual with a firm, there's always three things that I really want them to get out of the meeting. Particularly if they are a firm that is looking for authorization with the central bank. And so they do a pre-authorization meeting. The first thing you want to know is, are there any showstoppers in my application? Is there something that I'm proposing to do that is just not going to pass muster? Or is there something that I want to do that's going to be really difficult, or something that the regulator hasn't seen before, or something that they're going to impose conditions on me or financial constraints that are so expensive, it effectively means I can't go ahead with what I'm trying to do. Much better to learn that early in the day than as you get towards the end of an authorization process and you've spent all of the time and resources on it and find that you're not going to get it over the line. So that's the first thing. Are there any showstoppers? Second thing I want to get out of it is I want to know what kind of time frame I'm working to. Okay, so usually authorization processes have, timeframes built into them from legislation to make sure they get through in a reasonable amount of time. But they can be not that they're aspirational, but they can be manipulated, for the want of a better word, and run in a way that if it says 6 months, that doesn't actually mean 6 months. It would be 6 months from the point you get to no comment. So you want to get a proper sense for how long this is going to be, particularly when you deal with firms who come from outside of the regulated financial services industry. They're not used to being beholden to a third party like a regulator who holds so much control over timing. That can be something that these, for example, fintech firms or whatever, find difficult to get their head around. That this project that I've dreamt up last night and my business plan today is going to take 9 months to a year before I get an authorization at the other side. So as good as you can gauge what the timeframes are that you're involved in is another key outcome to get from that meeting, because it'll help you to manage your own expectations and manage the expectations of the team or whoever it is that your stakeholders are. And the last thing that you want to get out of that meeting is you want to build trust. So you want the regulator to trust that you know what you're doing. You can be trusted with an authorization or to run an authorized firm, and that there's nothing that they need to worry about in you and your business above and beyond what they worry about for every regulator. So to build that level of trust with the regulator is absolutely essential, and one of the key outcomes you want to get from the meeting.
Yeah, I think, and you say about building trust, is that 100% based on the product, i.e. being able to answer all questions and demonstrate clearly that it will work, or is that deeper than just focusing on the product?
No, it's actually much deeper than that. So part of the conversation will be about the specifics of whatever product or whatever service it is that you're looking to offer. And they will, of course, want to know that you know all of the ins and outs of that. They'll want to know that you know the regulatory framework, that you know what rules it is that you're signing up to. But beyond that, they'll want to know about the business generally. They'll want to know what is the culture in this firm. They'll want to know what your approach is to risk and compliance. They'll want to know how well resourced you are. And so all of those things feed into their sense for whether or not you are, as an individual and a firm, somebody who can be trusted with a license to then go out and offer services to the public or to professional investors, whatever it is. But it goes much deeper than just simply what's written on the page.
Mm-hmm. And you say about showing one's approach to things like risk and compliance, for example. Does that come down to demonstrable things that the company has already done, or is it more about how they answer questions and what they'd be looking at showing in the future?
Well, it depends. So it depends on whether you're dealing with a firm that's applying for authorization or a firm that has been authorized and the meeting is part of a supervisory engagement. So if it's a firm that hasn't yet been authorized, but is doing a pre-authorization meeting, the regulator will want to know that you have properly thought about how you're going to approach risk and compliance, and that you are designing a framework that really matches it, and particularly that you're hiring people and enough people with enough experience to carry out those roles properly, that you're taking it seriously. With, again, I go back to firms and individuals that come from outside of the regulated industry. This tends to be one of their weak spots, one of their blind spots when it comes to regulation compliance. It's not something they're necessarily that used to. And sometimes I think the regulator will feel they're trying to bluff through it at a minimum. And the regulator will spot that in about 5 seconds. And that's where firms can fall down, particularly when in a pre-authorization. Post-authorization, it's about demonstrating that you've done what you said you would do. So listen, you can imagine if you're the regulator, you see this, Shannon, when we meet people, right? They will tell you what they think you want to hear, right? When we do our mock interviews, we interview as if we're the regulator. And people will tell you what they think you want to hear about culture or about risk or compliance. But once you start to dig into it and ask for evidence, show me where you challenged that decision. Show me where you spoke up and said that this was the wrong approach. Show me where an issue was brought to your attention and you took action. Demonstrate that through your minutes of your board meeting, through your reporting, through your email correspondence, through whatever, through systems in the compliance network that you have. Then, as a regulator, my assumption is that I'm going to challenge everything you say and I'm going to treat it with healthy skepticism. So I assume you're pulling my leg when you say I have to prove it, because otherwise you just tell me what I want to hear.
Okay, no, thank you. For everybody else who's joined us, we try and make these as interactive as possible. So I should have said earlier, apologies, but please do feel free to jump in and either raise your hand or write any questions in the Q&A at any stage and get any questions asked. One for both of you, Shannon, because I know you look out for this and have some sort of what I would say is scarily easy ways of being able to see and read through people. How do they know if startups are bluffing? Because I mean, you watch people and some are very good storytellers, and especially looking at, I'm exposed to lots of startups, and some you can see maybe people are being optimistic, but they really believe what they're saying. How can regulators see through that, either from a practical or from a body language based point of view?
You want to start, Shannon?
Yeah, I'm reflecting on a couple of the last sessions that Danny and I did together. So you're getting a really lovely version of Danny today. In the mock interviews.
I've only ever seen a lovely version of Danny.
About 2 weeks ago, I remember sitting back going, Jesus, Danny. Imagine him wearing a flak jacket, and his sole purpose is to find the weakness in your company in a way that puts you under enormous pressure and stress, and it's deliberate. So we'll begin with a baseline. So in a couple of minutes, we'll be able to determine whether or not, what your normal is. And if you consider, the most obvious insight that I can share at this point is, when you're speaking from a place of confidence and subject matter that you have enormous expertise on, you're quite coherent, you're very deliberate, you're poised, you make healthy eye contact. And when you're not, you tend to look away, get a bit fidgety, your shoulders drop, your eyes move in different directions, your voice changes, your pitch and tone. So when I spend 60 minutes with you, it's very clear in those 60 minutes, the form of you that shows up when you're very confident and the form of you that shows up when you're not confident. So Danny's comment a bit earlier, when the regulator digs deep into a few questions, that's when you typically see people go and their eyes divert and their hands get fidgety and they can't really get their breath, or their throat goes immediately dry, or their left shoulder starts shrugging. So these are all unconscious things that we do. Everybody does, regardless of what geographical location you're from or culture, that start revealing that you're uncomfortable with what you're saying in that particular moment.
But
sorry, I was going to say, like, the reason I like working with Shannon, I love what she does. So she's a human behavior expert. She can read all of this body language very, very accurately. It's scary how she's able to do it. It's worth bearing in mind that, you know, when you meet a regulatory team, whether there's supervision or authorization, they're not necessarily human behavior experts, but they are trained to some extent in interview skills and all that, which would include this. So they will be on the lookout for telltale signs. And so when we work together, as Shannon says, we're not giving away too much of the magic sauce. There is a nice, comfortable intro where you're getting a baseline. And then after about 5 minutes, I'd say, Shannon, that's when you start to probe with some of the questions.
The wrath of Danny.
And then you can see the stress. So, you know, there'll be something in there that will take the individual out of their comfort zone. You'll talk about an incident, or you talk about how they approach risk, or you talk about what their business continuity plan is, or what the succession is, or how they're outsourcing it. Whatever it is, there'll be something there, and immediately they'll have shifted from their comfort zone into bullshitting you, basically. And you can spot that. And then once you get that, or inconsistencies, particularly if you're interviewing more than one person from the same business and you ask them,
there you go, yeah,
they're the same. If you tell me we're managing 100 million and you tell me we're managing 300 million, then immediately I know there's something up, right?
Right.
So it's not that hard. So in terms of how do I know a founder is being overly optimistic? Well, firstly, if I'm dealing with a founder and the regulator is dealing with a founder, you assume they're being over optimistic. It's kind of probably the trait that you need to be in a startup and a founder. So you'll assume they're putting their best foot forward, and then you will look to kind of maybe take them down a peg or two, or challenge their projections. Projections overly optimistic. And then also what they will do is they will push you on how much capital you're going to have in your business before you start up. So if you're projecting losses for years 1, 2, and 3, guess what you're going to need to have in the kitty before they'll give you a letter of authorization. You'll need to have enough cash to cover all of that, and your minimum capital requirements, and a buffer. So it won't be that hard for them to find in any founder's proposal items that require more attention. Because that's what the regulator is all about: risk.
I think the question that just came up from Anthony is for you, Danny.
Sorry, what's the question?
So there's a question regarding startups. Will the regulator look negatively if one of the staff, presumably one of the founders specifically, is functioning in multiple roles, such as the MLRO is also the director, or HR, it's also compliance and so forth?
No, not necessarily, right? So the regulator understands that, particularly, so that is called nature, scale, and complexity, right? So if you are a startup, right, the regulator is going to view you differently than if you are the world's largest asset management firm. The world's largest asset management firm, I expect them to have any amount of staff and expertise. If you're a startup, it's not the same. So they will look at you differently, and they will allow for the fact, because effectively you'll be a smaller business and posing less risk to the economy and to everybody else, because if you fell over, and hopefully you won't, obviously, but if you did, the impact is going to be less. So they will view you differently. But the thing you have to bear in mind is, and this is where firms trip up when they approach the regulator with dual hatting proposals. So dual hatting is an individual doing multiple roles, is that you have to have the proper skills and experience for all of the roles that you're taking on. So what you typically find is a firm will come to the regulator and they'll want one individual to do risk and compliance, okay? Regulator will be open to that if it's a small business and one person can cope with the volume of work. But where you fall over is the person that they're proposing has tons of experience in risk, but doesn't know compliance because they've never worked in that area. And immediately the regulator will be negatively disposed because you're hiring somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. for the compliance portion. So if you can get somebody who's properly skilled in all of the roles you want them to do, you've got a chance. If you're chancing your arm, probably not.
And so startups presumably sometimes have to cost cut and can't afford to hire all of those. Would that be then viewed as negatively, or would that be viewed as a realistic stepping point until they can?
No, like, you're not expected to be fully fledged and fully staffed as if you were the world's largest asset manager when you're two guys in a garage, right? So there is an expectation, but what as the regulator you would look to do is see that for example, the resourcing and the staffing in the business will increase in tandem with the growth of that you're not planning to be two guys in a garage when you're managing trillions of assets under management, right? So they will look to see that it matches. They're not necessarily linear, but there should be a correlation between the two. Business goals, that'll happen. And that's generally how they will approach it. There will be kind of a day one, day two, if the regulator trusts that you follow through. So you can see that you're not expected to have all of the staff on the books when you submit the application for authorization. They can come when you are about to be authorized. So they will be realistic, the regulator, in terms of the practicalities of running the business. But by the way, they will push you hard, push you on the amount of capital that you have in, the way that you approach risk and compliance, because the barrier to getting to entering the regulated business is high. And by the way, it should be.
I want to tweak Anthony's next question, if I may. With your permission, Anthony. This one's for you, Danny. Would it look better if some of the staff are FCA regulated within a small firm? But I'd like you to speak to, what is the outcomes for a firm that has an FCA regulated individual, and what happens when that person is not FCA regulated? Like, can you just compare and contrast those two situations?
Sure, and let me start with this, because this is push my button, right? It look better, right? Don't worry about would it look better. Would it be better? Would it be better if you had a regulated business?
Now we're starting to see a bit of
people that knew what they were doing. Yes, it would be better if you had a regulated business that hired people who knew what they were doing, had experience. It's as easy as that. So when you approach the regulator, whether it's the FCA, the central bank, any other regulator, right, with an authorization proposal, if you are planning to staff the business with people who are the best developers and the best code writers and app developers and all that in the world, but you have nobody in the business who has any experience being a regulated business. I said the regulator is all about risk. It'll go through the roof. The flags will be everywhere because you just don't, it's not credible that, or there's so much risk that you're going to run that business in a way that falls over because you haven't met your regulator. So you will have less risk in your business if you have people involved who know what they're doing, come from that world, than if you don't. And if you decide to pursue a model or an approach that doesn't have people involved who have been regulated, then you're going to have to think about how else am I going to manage, mitigate, monitor, eliminate the risk? Well, I better get them trained, or I better have support from external providers on a secondment basis or whatever, advisors who know what they're doing and who can guide me through and hold my hand. So if you're better to have FCA or whatever experienced individuals in the business, if you're not going to have that, have something that makes up for the fact that you now have more risk in the business. But in terms of getting an authorization through the regulator without anybody involved who's been a regulated business, you're definitely at the bottom of a steep hill. I wouldn't say it's impossible, but you'd have to have a lot of mitigants in place.
And what is the best way for startups to go about that then? Is it say, hey, we don't have this yet, but the plan is the next hire is such and such and such and such, i.e. to approach it realistic and like that they're aware of what their shortfalls are, i.e. to show clearly we know we don't have X person, we know we don't have X role, and this is the plan for the next hire, for example, so that they're showing that they're realistic about their weaknesses?
Yeah, well, that's absolutely one thing. When you do meet the regulator, they will ask you about your weaknesses. It's usually, well, again, I don't want to game away, but usually when we're wrapping up our interview, we would ask, I'm your supervisor, I'm your regulator, what should I be worried about with your firm? Likewise, so the regulator will ask you, what are your weaknesses? So you're best to have an answer for that question. My weakness is I don't yet have, I want one individual to do risk and compliance. It's hard to find people in the current market because there's, labor short, tight labor market. It's very hard to find somebody who's both skilled, but that's what we want to do. So we're out looking and we've engaged an expert recruitment firm to have, or whatever it is, got to have an answer for it. And as I said, you won't necessarily have to have that individual in situ when you submit your application for authorization, but you should expect that you have to have them by the time or on the date of authorization, or before authorization. So you might have 6 to 9 months to get that person in place.
Great, thank you. There's a question from Leo. Do regulated areas such as GDPR fall under the financial regulators' remit?
Well, no, that's the data protection commissioner is primarily responsible for that, but the regulator will be interested in how you comply, not only with the rules that they're responsible for, but more generally, the rules that the business is responsible for. So, for example, you have to be fit and proper to run one of these businesses, right? You have to know what you're doing, and you have to be a person who's not a scoundrel. If they found that you had a business that dumped nuclear waste in the sea, or that engaged in slavery, or played fast and loose with the rules in GDPR and transferred data outside the EU, or whatever it was, even though they're not rules that the regulator is responsible for, it raises a flag that, well, if you don't care about environmental rules, you don't care about labor rules, then do you really care about regulated financial services rules? Probably not. And then also, are you a fit and proper person? Like in the UK, there was somebody who was banned because they had thousands and thousands of euros of pounds of unpaid train tickets. Now, it was £30,000, something that was a lot, but they had £1,000 of unpaid train tickets, and they were found to be not a fit and proper person to be involved in running a regulated business. So even though they're not necessarily directly responsible for legislation, the regulator is interested.
Just out of interest, is that because they just skipped on paying train fares, or?
I think they were coming in, they were commuting from Kent or Reading or somewhere around London, came in and out every day for a long time, didn't pay any train tickets, and presumably were in an occupation that gave them enough income to pay train tickets if they wanted to. It's a good idea, but there you go. You have to be careful. Everything comes back to you.
Interesting, thank you. So one question, a lot of people on here will be working in crypto or crypto-related companies, and obviously we're seeing a huge backlog at the moment in sort of companies waiting to get regulated, or wanting to get regulated, or just wanting any clarity whatsoever from regulators, which seems to be lacking. Are there any specific tips you'd give to crypto companies, or do you have any sort of hints around that? I mean, obviously regulators are being probably more careful because it's a new area and playing with money, and it's obviously so evolving so quickly, but crypto companies or any companies related to crypto seem to be struggling a lot with regarding waiting to be regulated. What would you say there?
Well, so there's a couple of things. Firstly, the regulator can only authorize firms that are engaged in regulated activities. So, and oftentimes, because of the way that crypto and asset classes like that are approached at the moment, they're not actually regulated. They're not actually financial instruments as we know them. So you're not, in many cases, you're not actually engaged in a regulated activity. So the regulator can't offer you an authorization unless you're doing something that requires authorization. So sometimes firms say, in this space, and maybe it's just loose language, but they'll say, we want to get regulated. But what are you going to get authorized as? Well, we do crypto, but crypto's not a financial. So you can't just volunteer to be regulated. You have to be engaged in an activity that requires it. And at the moment, for quite a bit of the activity in this space, it's just not regulated at the moment. But that's on the way. Certainly in the EU, under the markets and crypto assets regulation, which will take a little bit of time, but it's coming. And when that does come, that will be quite a game changer, because there won't be any way to operate effectively unless you come and get authorized. And as I said before, the barrier to entry is going to be high. So that is the first thing. If you are engaged in a regulated activity and you do approach the regulator, I'll go back to what I said before. The regulator's primary concern is about risk. Okay, and so if you think of what you hear about crypto and Bitcoin in the media, and the regulator pays very close attention to all of that, it's all about crypto wars, right, and fraud and all that. It just screams risk. And I'm going to just digress for a second, but if you look at all of the rules that are in place to regulate securities markets are there for a reason. So why can't you manipulate markets? Why can't you pump and dump? Because it's bad for the people who are sods who invested in the securities, and all of the kinds of things that are regulated out of the securities market in sector exist seems to me, in the unregulated market, where you're talking about crypto. And the reason those activities and those actions happen, the pump and dump, is because it's not banned, but it is banned in securities markets. So there's a reason why securities markets have all of the rules that they have, and in due course they'll apply to crypto and digital assets. But it takes a little bit of time because the regulators are always playing catch up, and they're trying to figure out what is the best way to approach it. It's not necessarily by regulating it the way they would have regulated equities, for example.
And one question for you, which hasn't been posed here, but which has been asked by lots of people, lots of times: does prior involvement in an ICO or anything like that cause sort of lasting damage, or is that viewed negatively? I mean, there's ICOs and ICOs, but as a blanket question, maybe you can expand perhaps.
How did the ICO go? Was it a legitimate ICO, or was it scam that has brought regulatory focus or enforcement actions against you? So will it count against you? Well, it depends, because as I said before, in order to be involved with the management at a senior level in a regulated business, you have to be, in Ireland it's fit and proper, in the UK they have something equivalent, which means you have to know what you're doing, you have to be trustworthy. And you find individuals where, for example, here we had a massive banking crash in 2010. Individuals who have been involved at some point in the past in organizations that had issues with the regulator or were sanctioned appear a few years later to have a directorship approved. And next thing you know, the regulator is asking questions about, well, you were involved in that bank and it had this issue, and what did you do about it? And then you find that they won't approve you under F&P. So if you have been involved in an ICO and it's been sanctioned by SEC or wherever else, then when you come to do your application, you'll have to, have you ever been involved in something? Yes. And you'll find that the regulator is very interested. And you find that it is much more difficult for people who have been involved in businesses that have had regulatory issues to get a new approval from the or any other regulator. So,
does that even count if it's employees or more founders?
Well, it'll count depending on where you are in the food chain in the business, right? If you're making tea and putting out the biscuits, maybe not. If you are making all of the decisions and running the business, it probably will. But as I said, regulators approach everything with healthy skepticism. So if you tell me you're doing tea and biscuits, I might want to probe further to see if that's actually the case.
No, thank you. And how much further would they probe on that?
Listen, when you deal, and I go back because we're dealing a lot here with people who aren't necessarily from a regulated business, right? When you deal with any regulator, you have to be open and transparent, right? You can't approach it on the basis that they may never find out, right? You have to approach it on the basis that I better tell them, because they will find out at some point. And if they find out 5 or 10 years down the line, then they're going to be most displeased that you kept the information from them. So it's quite different dealing with a regulator than dealing with just an ordinary unregulated business, because you don't get your right to remain silent, really. You have to be open and upfront and tell what happened in the past, and not try and sugarcoat it. Like there was a sanction for a person over here in the last 6 months, say, where they had applied for a new role and hadn't disclosed. They disclosed that when they left their previous employment that there was a labour case around unfair dismissal. But what it transpired was that they were dismissed for something to do with taking checks or something like that, something that involved dishonesty, and they didn't disclose it in the application. And that was not viewed very favourably by the central bank when it came to light. So I think your mindset has to be open and transparent with the regulator, and that's what they expect. Even when it comes to sanctioning, they'll come in and inspect you, and they expect you to take out all the records that demonstrate where things went wrong. Whereas if it were other types of tribunals and inquiries, you would have much more of a right to an expectation that you kind of fight your corner. It's not the same in the regulated world.
So it sounds like, Denny, there is an opportunity to have a healthy working relationship with the regulator, even if you haven't been blemish-free coming into whatever role or whatever authorization process you're in now. And it's not necessarily about putting stuff under the carpet or trying to fluff over things, but presenting open and transparent. One, is very scary. Two, you think the worst, but it's actually in your favor. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. So if I'm dealing with a firm, right, that has had a breach or some sort of an issue, own it, fix it, keep it fixed. That's what I always say, right? It's your business. If it's gone wrong, own it, right? Find out what it was that went wrong, why it went wrong, fix it, and make sure it stays fixed. And when you approach the regulator, right, because you're going to have to tell them, you have to fess up if there's any breaches or issues in the business. When you approach them, we've identified this issue and this is how we're going to fix it. And you'll probably find that notwithstanding that, they'll issue you what they call a risk mitigation program. So they'll issue you with a correspondence to say, you have to take these steps to fix the problem. And by the way, you better keep it fixed, because at some point in the future, they will come back and check whether the new reporting line or whatever it was that you put in place to fix it has stuck. Because the breach will be bad enough to annoy them. But if they find that you put in place a fix that you dispensed with as soon as you thought the regulator wasn't looking at them anymore, that's going to drive them over the edge. And if you look at regulatory sanctions, right, tend to be, when firms get as far as being hit with a fine by a regulator, it doesn't tend to be one incident where they found it, owned it, found it, fixed it, kept it fixed. It tends to be they found it and they fixed it and then they broke it again, or they took a long time to fix it. And you find that there's a whole pattern of things going wrong before you actually get to a sanction. So you do need to be open and transparent. And you can build a better relationship with the regulator if you can demonstrate that actually we understand what went wrong and we're genuinely trying to fix it. Compensate our investors if that's what needs to happen, and be a good business that's responsible. Because the regulator knows things go wrong. They know that breaches happen. It happens quite regularly. You're not the only one. But if you approach it by putting your head in the sand or trying to be difficult with the regulator, you know, it's a very different outcome than if you, as I said, you own it, fix it, and keep it fixed.
No, thank you. There's a question from Andrew. If my business is based in the UK, but all customers are in Africa, does the regulator see that exactly as a UK serving company, or how would that be seen?
No idea.
That's just
I don't know. Like, I mean, to be honest with you, it's very hard to comment on something like that with no more information. So it wouldn't be fair for me to do that.
Okay. One question for you, which again, I am often asked or often hear talked about it, especially in the crypto space, is a conversation around decentralized versus decentralized. And there's now some decentralized companies looking at getting regulated, and some see that there's benefits to getting regulated. Some see that would cause more stress and hassle, and it's better to stay away from that. Have you any points on the advantages, especially for companies in the crypto space that are looking at sort of operating on a more decentralized route, such as some of the ones that are looking at having DAOs, for example? Are there any that are clear? Are there any clear benefits to either to getting regulated or to not getting regulated, other than perhaps the obvious?
Like, I mean, so when you are regulated, although it's no guarantee from the regulator, no regulator will guarantee your performance or anything like that. It is definitely a source of comfort for somebody who's going to deal with a firm if they know that they're regulated, because it demonstrates objectively a level of seriousness about the business in terms of the way that the business is run, the systems that they operate, the standards that they operate to, the kind of people involved in running the business, the capital that's behind the business. And it gives you, as somebody who's going to use that firm, as I said, comfort that they know what they're doing and that hopefully they will look after you in your best interests and not fall over or run away at the first sign of trouble. Absent that, if you are an unregulated business, then as somebody who's going to deal with you, you don't have any of that comfort. And I think it's especially apparent, right, if the service that if you have two firms delivering similar services and one is regulated and one is not regulated. So immediately you'd have to ask the question, how come they're not regulated? They're obviously delivering it in a slightly different way that means it's not a regulated activity, that they can avoid regulation, or they're not covered by regulation. But why wouldn't they choose to do it? Why would they choose to do it that way? Why would they choose to circumvent? And the reason is because it's expensive to be regulated. But personally, I think that the level of comfort you get dealing with a regulated firm is exponentially higher. And if it's possible to, you would always deal with regulated. Plus, sorry, just to add, in the EU, then of course you get passporting rights. So if you're authorized in one member state, for most financial services activities, you can carry out the same activities in other EU member states, and usually EEA member states, through a notification to your regulator, and you can set up a branch, or you can operate on a freedom to provide services basis. So it opens up the entire market to you across the EU by having one license.
We have another question about the cost. So can you, Danny, give an indication of the costs involved dealing with regulation? So specifically, how much would it cost to apply to be regulated? And then what are the fees involved for maintaining that regulatory status? And what changes those fees, if anything?
Well, the answer is a lot, right? And you know, people focus on, well, of course, what I do, professional services fees. So what's the lawyer's fees or the support fee for the authorization application, that kind of stuff. So I'll come to that in a second, but I wouldn't get so fixated on that, right? That's when you look at your list of costs, that's not the biggest one. The biggest one is you're going to need X amount of people. They're all going to be senior executives. They're in a very, you know, they're in a marketplace that has a lot of demand, so they're expensive, right? So you got a staff cost. You're going to have to pre-fund any projected losses for your first 3 years. You're going to have to overcapitalize the business in addition to complying with regulatory capital requirements. So, for example, if you're an EMI, Electronic Money Institute, it's 350,000 or a quarter of your projected first year's overheads, or then there's another calculation based on the amount of transactions that you're processing, right? So all of that stuff is much higher than what your regulatory fee is going to be. Like, I mean, you're into seven figures, and especially if you are a part of a regulated financial services group already, right? The regulator knows you, they knows there's entities of significant substance behind it, and if there's a guarantee from HQ or the mothership back to the Irish branch or the UK branch or whatever it is, then that carries a lot of weight. They can be comfortable that there'll be money there to put into the business as and when it's required, and that the people will, you know, if it turns out that the business doesn't work as you had hoped, that there's people there and resources there to keep it going or to wind it up properly. If you are a startup and you are people in the garage or whatever, you know, you don't have that behind you. So the regulator is going to want to know in advance that you've got tons of capital there to make sure the business can be turned around and kept going whilst you figure your way, or else wind it up in a way that doesn't disadvantage the people who dealt with the business. And that's where tons of the cost comes in. You know, and fundraising is a big issue and not easy, because people, you know, whatever the investment environment is like, they're handing over large sums of cash. They're going to want to know a lot about the business and that it's a good investment. So that bit of it is a much bigger challenge. In terms of fees, like, I mean, usually some regulators charge authorization fees, some don't, but they'd be in the thousands rather than hundreds of thousands. They'll charge an annual supervisory fee. So in Ireland, if you were a low impact firm, it's about €9,500. If you are medium low, it's about €95,000. If you're higher than that again, it can go up to $500,000. You can expect it's similar in other jurisdictions. So that's your ongoing fee. In terms of your advisory fees, again, like, I mean, it'll range from tens of thousands up to over 100,000, depending on what you're trying to do and how much support you need and how much of the activities you can do yourself. So it is absolutely, it's not cheap, that bit of it, but it's the rest of it, the infrastructure and the staff and the capital. That's where the real bite comes.
Thank you. There's an interesting question here. Is there any chance to ask the regulated questions on a no names or anonymous basis if you do disclose who you are or what your question is confidentiality guaranteed?
What's this got to do with meeting the regulator? Okay, I think if you deal with the regulator, you should expect that they will want to know who you are. Okay, when I was there, we used to get questions on a no names basis, and we would always push back and say, well, what firm does this relate to? The other thing to bear in mind is that certainly in Ireland, and I'm assuming it's the same everywhere, is that regulators are subject to freedom of information. So they will not disclose they won't necessarily publish that you've asked them this question on a website. But there is a chance, depending on the nature, that it could get disclosed under freedom of information. So you should bear that in mind. Also, again, in Ireland, and same as the UK, I'm sure, you're subject to the Lobbying Act. You know, depending on who you're engaging with in a regulator, if you were engaging, trying to have a rule change or something like that, you might have to register and put onto a public register that you've interacted with the regulator. So all of those things, right, mean that it may be disclosed, the interaction that you've had. Having said that, They have things like sandboxes and in Ireland, the Innovation Hub that you can engage with, you can ask questions with. They're quite open and will do their best to put you on the right path. You can do that. You can engage with your supervisory team if you want to. But I would be hesitant to think that you can engage with the regulator on a no-names basis and that it won't end up either them identifying the firm or it being subject to something like FOI. It's always a risk in the background.
All right, thank you.
We've got a few minutes left, Erica. Do you want to ask Jack's question?
I'll go through Anthony's as well. So
Yeah.
regarding crypto firms, there seems to be an exodus to Gibraltar as they're leading, and not just Gibraltar, to America and anywhere else that isn't the UK, seemingly. But Anthony's saying to exodus to Gibraltar as they're leading the way regarding regulation for digital assets. Is the FCA frowning upon companies looking for regulation in other jurisdictions, but wanting to do business in the UK? And expanding on that, we've seen a lot of crypto companies looking to go elsewhere, America and other countries, purely due to the backlogs and delays here in the UK. But how is that viewed, Danny?
Well, a couple of things there. Firstly, the B word, Brexit, right? UK is no longer obviously in the EU, so is no longer obliged to allow firms from other jurisdictions to passport in. So if you are in the EU and a regulated firm, a firm goes to Gibraltar and gets authorized, then they're entitled to passport around the union. Well, sorry, certainly if they're Malta is the other one. Gibraltar, I have to check that. I'm not quite sure the regulated status. But if you're in the EU, you are entitled to passport around, and the host member state cannot lift the lid on your authorization application and wonder what the standards are like in that other member state. They're expected to be the same. But for the UK, obviously, they're outside of the EU, they have much more autonomy to determine whether or not they will allow a firm from another jurisdiction to carry out activities in their area. They would need to be convinced that the system that applies in Lithuania or Latvia or Liechtenstein or Gibraltar or wherever else is a standard that they are happy with, and they'd be perfectly entitled to say that they're not satisfied that it is at the right level and that impose additional conditions or restrict them from acting. Likewise, if they come from the US. So there is no right to carry out activities, and you may well find that that they ask more questions. And so the basic question is, but why did you go to a jurisdiction that doesn't necessarily have an established financial services industry in the way that other countries do? Why did you determine that you're going to set up there, and be prepared for that? Because that's the I guess the other side of the coin when you go to jurisdictions like that to get authorized.
Anthony said being regulated in Gibraltar allows companies to solicit business in the UK. Someone else has asked, are there any regulators more crypto friendly in the EU? If so, where? And would that make passporting any easier if one obtained a license from the regulator in that more crypto friendly country? I mean, on a practical note, I've heard of Germany being much more clear regulation wise than the UK and other places, and the companies looking to go to Germany and Switzerland. Have you any other comments on that?
Well, as I said, the whole European system is built around equal standards across the union. So if you're authorized in Germany or France or Malta or anywhere else, the standard will be the same, should be the same as if you were authorized in Ireland or Sweden, right? So once you are authorized in one, you are entitled to passport all of the other jurisdictions. If you go to a jurisdiction where they are more familiar with the asset class and the type of business, and so you find that they're more receptive or just more expert, the authorization application goes through more quickly than if you went to a country where they've never done one before. You can imagine you're starting from scratch, so you get more questions. Once you do that and passport in, well, then really all the home jurisdiction is responsible for generally is supervision of conduct of business rules, which is pretty light. So that's the way that the system is set up. That's generally how it operates. I suppose the flip side is, would an investor wonder why you went to one of these jurisdictions rather than a more established jurisdiction? Would they be hesitant as a result? Maybe they wouldn't, but it's worth bearing in mind.
Thank you. Last interesting questions from Jack. How do you think the outcome is influenced by the individual regulators' inherent human biases? Good, good question, especially seeing as AI is apparently also heavily influenced by its biases that it's trained by its programmers. So that there must be an element of that.
I'll let you take that one, Shannon.
Yes, is the answer. There will be 2 states. One is conscious, so what we're actually aware of, and we will take steps to ensure balanced and thoughtful feedback and consideration and decisions being made. But then there's the unconscious part, which we have no idea is there, but it's definitely there and driving the show for the most part. But one of the things I would say, particularly in this area, is you have a team. The regulator doesn't operate alone as an individual, and so they'll be able to have conversations with their peers who can also challenge their decision or add intel to the decision so that you're getting the best for the economy, for your customers, and for your firm.
Yeah, it won't be one versus one. It'll be probably a team of 4 from the central banks that ought to mitigate bias or unconscious bias. Plus, they'll have obviously been trained and will be looking for it. But of course, they'll have experience from, for example, if they've dealt with a ton of firms coming in looking for a crypto license, for example, they have found a pattern of behaviors amongst them or a pattern of weaknesses amongst them. And that once they see that repeated, it kind of immediately raises flags. The next thing you know, they've nearly made their decision based on before they've gone through the full process, or they've heard enough and they've heard enough similarly. They're already well down the track to making a decision.
Mm-hmm. A last question from Jack: do decision makers get pressure from above, such as from government or from regulator senior management, to make decisions based on their view, such as the regulator's view of the whole sector, such as, I don't know, it would be good to authorize more of X type of company, or we don't want X type of company? Well,
no, in a word. The regulator is independent of government and independent of departments of finance or treasury agencies. Certainly in Ireland, one of the changes that they made post the bank crisis I mentioned was to remove the mandate to promote the financial services industry. So prior to 2010, they had that mandate for a while. It was considered to be a conflict of interest, or possibly a conflict of interest, that you couldn't properly authorize and supervise when you also have to promote the industry. So now they don't. So they will be no more keen on having crypto firms than any other type of firm, MiFID, banks, insurance companies, anything else. So they do listen to industry, and they are engaging a lot with stakeholders around developing frameworks, and whether it's an authorization or a supervision approach that facilitates better firms coming to market and being properly authorized and supervised, and having regimes that suit them in terms of that fit the kind of business that they're doing. But you will never hear a regulator come in and say, well, we want to authorize more market makers.
Mm-hmm. I would swap the word pressure for influence, only because of the situation we had a couple of years ago here with Brexit, that had a number of firms from London wanting to set up shop here in Dublin. And the language was shifting sands. And there was an influence, Brexit, that was taking place, that was changing how things were being done. But it wasn't about pressure so much as, well, from what I recall, Danny, wasn't ESMA and the central bank here working together and collaborating almost on how to navigate?
Yes, so I mentioned the slightly long answer that in Europe, that the way that regulators across the different countries approach their job ought to be pretty much the same. So if you get, it's not true entirely in practice, but generally, part of all that is the European Securities and Markets Authority, ESMA, in Paris, and one of their jobs is supervisory convergence. So they want to try and make sure that if I'm sitting in my central bank office in Dublin, that I'm viewing things the way that my peers in Spain or Italy are as well, right? And so one of the things that they were concerned about post-Brexit was that there would be a race to the bottom, that all of these firms would look in London and in the UK would look to establish European presences to get their market access to the EU. The regulators would not be as thorough and demanding of those firms in terms of an authorization application as they might otherwise be. And so as in collaboration with the various regulators, produced opinions that said, when you approach an application for a Brexit relocating firm, these are the things you have to look out for. Make sure they've got enough staff. Make sure that it is a genuine relocation. Make sure that they're properly bought into being in the EU. And so that's one of the ways. So that's not pressure. That is supervisory convergence. That is making sure that the regulators around the union are acting in the same way. Completely different than saying, well, we don't have enough of, or let's have more crypto businesses or something like that. They'll approach all of that the same. What are the risks and what's the best way to manage, mitigate, monitor, eliminate them?
No, thank you. And just a last question from Anthony. Do you think that FCA is ready for the crypto industry, or even wanting to be ready for the crypto industry?
Well, they certainly want to say that they are, because there seems to be a kind of a post-Brexit narrative about the position that the UK's financial services market wants to be in, and to attract various types of businesses and to be cutting edge, and the fact that they have regulatory sandboxes kind of facilitates that. So they certainly are putting that forward as where they would like to be in the world. If it's true in practice, I think to an extent, it's a tricky one to be the first in the door for, I think, if you're a regulator, right? I would, if I were the regulator, I would like to be somewhere in the middle. I'd like others to have gone down this path and mistakes, and I'd like to learn from them. Because every time you authorize a firm, whether it's crypto or insurance or anything else, you as a regulator are putting your badge and your reputation on the line, that these people deserve authorization and know what they're doing. And so, as I said, if I were a regulator, I'd like others to have paved the way a little bit, which is why in Europe you've got the MiCA, the Markets of Crypto Assets regulation, which kind of brings everybody at the same speed to it. UK will try and get ahead of that.
Thank you. Very conscious of your time. One last question from me, but voicing a question that's been asked a lot of times by a lot of people. In the UK, is the delay around crypto and the backlog, is that largely due to Brexit and coronavirus and other sort of wider market delays, or is that due to really not knowing what to do with the crypto space, or not wanting to make a decision?
All of the above.
All of the above.
Right.
Everything, right? So when you, like, crypto is quite different than what regulators would have experienced before in terms of what they're trying to authorize and manage, right? So maybe it's not the best thing to just take your rules that you apply to securities markets and control, alt, delete, and replace with crypto, right? Maybe you need to have a more nuanced and clever approach because of the specificities of the market. So it does take time to come up with the right way to regulate these firms and supervise them, given the way that they operate and the tech heavy that they are. But on top of that, you're trying to do that in an environment where people are working from home. You're trying to do it in an environment where you've just had Brexit, so they're probably seeing more activity because you're having firms having to change their licenses, and firms that were able to passport into the UK to change their authorization status to be, to reflect the post-Brexit world. So they are busy. Regulator here is the same, very, very busy, just on general day-to-day, plus you're doing it from home. Plus, it's not necessarily that easy to recruit staff because the market generally is demanding for people. And I put all that in the mix, and things just take longer than you would like them to do. If you had a dedicated resource and a dedicated team and all the time in the world, you could do this. But they're trying to do it in addition to doing everything else.
Oh, amazing. But thank you so much, Danny and Shannon, for those insightful answers, and to everyone for all your questions. Thank you very much for joining us and for your time.
Thank you.
Good to see you again, Danny.
Cheers, Danny. Bye.